What if grief itself could become a weapon? What if a brother's silence, broken by lash and loss, could ignite more than sorrow, could ignite revolt? Georgia, 1850. The plantations stretched like kingdoms across the red clay soil, kingdoms where masters feasted and enslaved bodies bent in endless rows. Within the big house, laughter floated with the smoke of roasted meats, and violins sang beneath candlelight. But beyond the columns, in the quarters, silence pressed down like a weight, broken only by whispers carried in the dark. It was in this silence that Frederick lived. He was not known for defiance nor for fury, but for endurance. He bent his back in the cotton fields from dawn until dusk, his hands torn and bleeding, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Yet the ledger of his life had been written not only in labor, but in loss, for the overseer's whip had taken his brother, not just with lashes, but with cruelty that left his body broken in the dust. Frederick watched the life leave him, watched his brother's chest rise once and then no more, while the master's household continued its feast, unbroken, unbothered. The quarters fell silent in mourning. Yet silence is not the absence of sound, it is the waiting before thunder. Frederick's grief was not a single wound, but a gathering storm, each day adding weight, each lash across another back, echoing his brother's death. The master believed his field secure, his overseer feared, his house untouchable. But grief is a flame that does not die in silence. It waits, it smolders, and when the right moment comes, it bursts into fire. What if one man's loss could ignite a revolt? What if a brother's death was not an ending, but the beginning of something no chain could hold? The year was 1850, a decade before war would split the nation. But Georgia's plantations were already drenched in conflict unseen. Cotton was king here, its white bowls stretching like endless seas across the red soil. Every bale was profit, every acre power, but that wealth was written in the torn hands and bent backs of the enslaved. The plantation where Frederick lived was no different. At its center stood the big house, a two-story monument of painted wood, columns rising to mimic ancient temples. Within, chandeliers hung heavy with crystal, their light falling on velvet chairs and portraits of pale ancestors, gazing down as if to bless the legacy of ownership. Around it, barns and stables sprawled, guarded by dogs and overseers alike. Beyond, stretching as far as the eye could follow, lay the cotton fields, rows upon rows of labor and silence, and at the edges of this empire huddled the quarters, wooden shacks built of rough planks, roofs patched with straw, floors of bare earth. It was here that Frederick rose each morning, his body stiff from cold and hunger. He had been born into bondage and knew no other world, but he carried a quiet strength, a stillness that others noticed. His back bore scars of the overseer's lash, scars that seemed less wounds than inscriptions, each one marking a day of survival. The overseer himself was known for cruelty. He wielded his whip not as a tool of labor, but as a weapon of authority. He lashed quickly, publicly, sometimes without cause, to remind all who bent in the fields that their bodies were his to command. His cruelty was not bound by necessity. It was sharpened by enjoyment. It was under this hand that Frederick's brother had suffered. Younger by 2 years, his brother was quick in the fields, his hands defthed with cotton, his spirit bright, despite the burden of chains. But brightness draws envy. One day, falsely accused of theft, he was dragged before the quarters and beaten without mercy. The whip cracked until flesh tore, until his cries faded, until silence fell heavier than the whip itself. Frederick had been forced to watch. His brother's last breath rose like smoke into the air, vanishing while the overseer spat in the dust and walked away. The master spoke of obedience and order, but his words were hollow. He read scripture at the table, invoking verses to sanctify chains. The mistress, dressed in silks, folded her hands in prayer while her servants starved. They proclaimed themselves Christian, but their gospel was written not on holy pages. It was written on ledgers, on prophet columns, on the flesh of the enslaved. For Frederick, grief settled deep. He rose to work, he bent his back, he said nothing. To the overseer, it seemed submission. To the master, it was forgetfulness. But in truth, it was neither. It was memory, quiet, unyielding, smoldering. At night, in the quarters, whispers told of resistance long past. Elders spoke of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, of men who had risen with blade and fire. Others recalled stories of Maroons, those who fled into swamps and mountains, building hidden lives beyond the reach of chains. The stories were dangerous to tell, but they endured, like coals kept alive in ash. Frederick listened. He did not speak, but each story was a stone laid in the foundation of his silence. He knew that chains could not be broken by mourning alone. The overseer's whip had killed his brother, but the master's house had sanctioned it. The ledger of cruelty was wide, and its debt demanded payment. And so Frederick waited, not with resignation, but with the patience of one who knew storms did not announce themselves until the sky split open. The days after his brother's death stretched like shadows that refused to lift. Frederick returned to the fields each morning, but the weight on his shoulders was no longer only cotton. It was grief hardened into resolve. The overseer barked, the whip cracked, the sun scorched, yet Frederick's silence deepened. He bent to his labor, but within him something gathered, quiet as a storm, hidden in still air. Life on the plantation offered no reprieve. The overseer walked the rows like a predator, whip dangling loose in his hand. He struck for slowness, for glances too high, for backs not bent low enough. The lash did not need reason. Cruelty was its own logic. Even children were not spared mockery. From the veranda of the big house, the master's sons laughed as they mimicked the cries of those beaten, their young voices echoing the habits of tyranny. Every act reminded Frederick that his brother's death had not been an accident. It was the natural consequence of a world built on chains. The quarters were filled with the slow rhythm of survival. Nights brought a chorus of whiskers and low songs, voices rising from the shadows of worn shacks. They sang of sorrow, of rivers and far-off lands, of freedom glimpsed in dreams. Some sang to endure, Others sang to resist. Frederick listened, though he rarely joined. His silence was not detachment, it was concentration, each note a drumbeat, marking the time until grief would shift into something else. Whispers began to circle around him. Some saw the stillness in his face and feared it. Others saw in him the outline of defiance. A few, quietly, approached him in the fields when overseers were distant. They spoke of hidden plans, of secret blades fashioned from scraps of iron, of escape paths through swamps. Frederick listened. He said little, yet within him the idea of revolt grew, not as fantasy, but as the only answer that matched his brother's death. The catalyst came with the season's end. Harvest brought profit to the master and celebration to his household. A feast was declared. Guests from neighboring plantations would arrive. The big house would blaze with music and wine, while the enslaved worked double to make the spectacle possible. Such nights revealed the gulf most clearly. One world feasting, the other starving. One world in silk, the other in rags. Frederick moved among the preparations, watching. He carried sacks of flour, hauled barrels of cider, and gathered wood for the kitchens. No one noticed the way his eyes lingered on doorways, on distances, on the timing of patrols. He counted how long the overseer stood by the stables, how often the master's sons strayed to the fields, how quickly the guards drank themselves dull on brandy. Each observation was a stone laid into a careful path. In the quarters, Frederick began to speak, quietly, carefully. His words fell like embers in the dark. He spoke not of escape, but of justice. He reminded them of the whip's mark, of children stolen and sold, of mothers buried in shallow graves. He spoke of his brother, how his laughter had been silenced, how his blood had soaked into Georgia's red soil. His voice did not rise in anger. It stayed low, steady, the voice of a man who knew what silence could become when it finally broke. Some feared him. They begged him to remain silent, to endure. For revolt meant death not only for the rebels, but for their families. Others felt their own scars burn at his words. They remembered their own losses, their own graves dug too early. Slowly, a circle formed around him, not large, but enough. A handful of men who carried their grief as he did, and women whose voices sharpened his resolve with whispers of support. The quarters began to hum differently. The songs still carried sorrow, but now sorrow shared space with defiance. The night of the feast approached, yet outside, at the far edge of the plantation, another gathering stirred. In the shadows of the quarters, Frederick stood with those who had chosen to follow. Their hands gripped crude weapons, axes borrowed from wood piles, knives hammered from scraps, clubs carved from branches. They did not carry the weapons of soldiers, but they carried something heavier. The knowledge that their lives, already claimed by bondage, could be spent in one final strike. The overseer, drunk on brandy and arrogance, walked the yard with his whip dangling, unaware that the very silence he had enforced was about to shatter. The dogs barked at the distant forest. but no one listened. The masters drank, their laughter rising. Frederick's eyes fixed on the big house, its windows glowing, its arrogance blazing. His brother's face rose in memory, the final breath, the broken body in the dust. The silence within him finally broke, not in words, but in motion. He lifted his hand, and in that gesture, the waiting storm began to move. The revolt had not yet erupted, but the night itself was ready, tense as timber dried for flame, waiting only for the spark. The feast inside the big house thundered with pride. Candles blazed, music swelled, and the master's voice outside. Shadows moved. Frederick led them, his steps slow, deliberate, the night air sharp against his skin. The crude weapons in their hands caught the faint moonlight. Axes dulled from woodcutting, knives hammered from iron scraps, clubs carved from fallen branches. They were not soldiers, but grief had armed them. The overseer staggered from the stable, brandy heavy on his breath. His whip dangled loose, its coils brushing the dirt. He did not see them until Frederick stood before him, his frame dark against the lantern's glow. The whip lifted, a reflex of power, but before it cracked, an axe swung. The sound was not a cry, but a dull final thud. The overseer fell, the whip sliding from his hand into the dirt. Silence held for a heartbeat, then broke. Feet rushing forward, hands tightening around weapons, voices low with the force of years unspoken. The quarters emptied, shadows joining shadows. Women pushed their children behind them, whispering prayers into their hair. Men surged toward the house, each step breaking the silence that had smothered them for generations. The dogs barked, but their chains held. The guards, drowsy with drink, stumbled too late. Clubs fell, blades flashed. Fear, long a master, now fled into the night. The big house doors burst open. The music faltered, laughter froze. Frederick and his circle entered not as servants, but as storm. Eyes widened, screams broke, the chandeliers trembled, as if the house itself felt the reckoning. The master rose from his chair, his mouth forming words of command, but command no longer held. A blade struck the table, splitting wood, scattering food. Goblets toppled, wine spilling like blood. Chaos unfurled. Guests scrambled, silk dresses tangled, boots clattered on polished floors. The mistress clutched her children, her prayers breaking into shrieks. Frederick's eyes found the master's, cold, steady, unyielding. For a moment, silence fell again, as if the entire house held its breath. Then the storm broke fully. Shouts rose, steel clashed, and the hall filled with the sound of revolt. Some guests fled into the night, their carriages overturning in haste. Others fell where they stood, their voices cut short. The firelight of the chandeliers flickered wildly, shadows leaping like spirits across the walls. The big house, once untouchable, became a theater of collapse. In the center of it all, Frederick moved with the calm of a man who had already lost everything. His brother's face lingered before him, not as sorrow, but as flame. Each strike, each cry, each step was an offering to the memory that had driven him here. When the smoke cleared, when the screams dwindled to silence, The big house no longer stood in triumph. Its columns still rose, its chandeliers still glimmered, but its illusion had shattered. The master's house had been built on chains. The revolt spoke the truth. By dawn, the plantation was unrecognizable. The big house still stood, its white columns catching the pale light. But its silence was no longer the silence of power. It was the silence of ruin. Broken chairs lay scattered across the dining hall, goblets overturned, food rotting on silver plates. The chandeliers still swung faintly, as if recalling the tremors of the night. The overseer's body was found near the stable, his whip coiled lifeless in the dirt. Guests who had fled left behind abandoned carriages, wheels broken in their haste. The master's voice, once booming with pride, had been silenced. Whether he lay among the fallen or staggered into the fields, no one could agree. The mistress was said to have vanished into the night, clutching her children, her prayers dissolving into the forest. In the quarters, fear and awe mingled. Some whispered that Frederick had been struck down in the chaos, his body hidden among the wreckage. Others swore they saw him vanish into the woods, leading a small band toward the swamps where Maroons had long built a hidden refuge. Still others believed he lingered as a ghost upon the land, bound not by chains, but by the memory of his brother's blood. The authorities came days later. Patrols of armed men rode through, their boots pressing the soil, their rifles gleaming. They dragged survivors into question, whipped confessions from tongues, and hanged those accused of leadership. Yet Frederick's name remained elusive. Some claimed he had been captured and buried in an unmarked grave, his body erased like ink struck from a ledger. Others insisted he escaped north, carried by secret hands along the Underground Railroad. But no document, no record, no official account gave certainty. His fate dissolved into the fog of silence. The plantation never fully recovered. Though rebuilt, its reputation carried the stain of revolt. Neighbors whispered of the night the enslaved rose, of the feast that ended in chaos. Guests hesitated to return, fearing that beneath every servant's silence lay another Frederick, another storm waiting to break. The master's family, whether alive or broken, dwindled into obscurity. The fields, once abundant, never seemed to yield the same. Years later, when war finally came and Union soldiers marched through Georgia, among the freed, the story of Frederick endured, not as fact, but as legend. Around fires, elders told children of the man who rose for his brother, who turned grief into revolt. His name became a whisper of defiance, a reminder that bondage was not absolute. Whether he had died that night or lived to see freedom mattered less than the truth his story carried, that even the strongest house of chains could be shaken, even the proudest master could tremble. Historians searched, but the records remained thin. A note of deaths at a feast, a mention of overseers lost, an erased line in a ledger. The written archive, shaped by those in power, sought to bury the revolt beneath silence. Yet silence cannot erase memory. Memory lived in song, in whispers, in the way the name Frederick carried weight long after his body had vanished. And so his story remains unresolved, suspended between history and legend. Perhaps he died beneath the chandeliers. Perhaps he walked into the swamps, his footsteps swallowed by reeds. Perhaps his spirit lingers still, pacing the fields where his brother fell. The big house crumbled, the overseer's whip rusted, the master's name faded from records. But Frederick's silence endures, heavy as thunder before the storm. What is justice when memory itself becomes the revolt? What is freedom when even silence refuses to forget?